Well, first off, I enjoyed the book. I automatically just kind of saw I don't want to be too complimentary, but I saw a masterful piece of writing in the sense that you easily know how to tell stories and make them very interesting in the sense of science writing. So I really, really enjoyed that. And it was quite refreshing because I
Thank you
think,
very much.
yeah, I think too many science writers tend to overdo it in a sense where they try to make it like too funny or too relatable, and you just happen to have that nice blend of the two that didn't make it unrelatable, if that makes sense.
Well, thanks. It was a lot of hard work. It's also, it was a lot more fun to research than to actually write.
Yeah, that was one of my questions. If you just want to get started, is what was the research process like? I mean, you mentioned in the book, traveling all over the place and reading all these stories, but how was that like for you? How was, researching and then writing out these stories?
Well, it was really fun. It started. I mentioned briefly in the book early on. It started because I wrote a children's book about a year before I began work on this book. And the kids' book is called 101 Questions About Volcanoes. And I did that one. I had a choice of any number of topics for kids on the natural world. And I picked volcanoes because I didn't know anything about them at the time. And I thought, well, here's a great excuse to learn a new world, but, not too much. Ha ha.
Right, exactly.
So, and so I started doing that, and in doing that, I talked to the national park experts who talked to the public at a number of volcano parks. That's where I started.
Wow.
I thought, okay, these are the people that go face to face with kids. So let's find out what kind of questions kids ask them. What's the weirdest question, the funniest question, the most touching question? And maybe I can find the answers to some of those, but let's make a master list of questions first.
Hmm.
So, as you know, because you know most of these techniques I'm talking about, based on the work you've done, I've seen that and I like it. You can learn a lot about a subject, especially if you're not an expert, by writing a series of questions for yourself and then trying to find the answers. And so I did that. Then I wrote them up, and I tried to be dramatic with the questions and tried to be a little bit of a wise guy. And I thought kids would like that. Didn't have to be reverent about the science.
Right.
And I kept in mind something that other science writers have told me over the years, and that is when, for example, I had a friend named John Luoma. He wrote a lot of pieces for Audubon and the New York Times biology section in Science Times. And when he would get a world-level scientist and find out that that scientist could not explain clearly what he was doing and why it was important, my friend John would stop him and say, hey, wait a minute. Pretend you're going to a dinner party of a colleague, and your colleague's bright 12-year-old daughter asks you, what do you do, mister? Tell her. And he would find that suddenly all the usual issues that come up around science communication could fall away in an instant. And the scientist would say something like, oh, well, it's like you take two building blocks made of wood and you clank them together and so forth.
Sure.
And it was really great. So I tried to use techniques like that to work with the kids.
Awesome. And then it just kind of evolved into this book, it sounds like.
Well, then there's this problem with writing, and if you have a deep curiosity, which I do, and if the world can contain that curiosity, which of course it can, which is that you start asking more and more complicated questions. And then the adult in me, the more complicated thinker in me, started coming through, and I thought, well, there's all these people around the world that live in the shadow of volcanoes, and I forget how many it was, and I think like, I don't know, a tenth of the world's population at least.
Wow.
And I thought, what effect does that have on them? And I've always been interested in how the natural world affects human beings, aside from, the food it provides and the air it keeps clean for us and so forth. And I started asking those questions. And then I decided to think about some, let's say, iconic volcanoes that would represent a certain kind of thing that volcanoes do and the effect they've had on people. And I started organizing my research that way.
Wow. That's amazing. And clearly, it was something you liked, and the passion comes across in the book, which is really, really helpful as well. We're seeing, the world of volcanoes through your eyes as you're first experiencing it. And I find that very entertaining.
Part
So,
of the reason it was
oh,
fun
please.
was, I already liked hiking and climbing mountains and going to new cultures and trying to figure them out and so forth. So it had all of that. And then it had the science. The science was a bit of a challenge, especially at
Sure.
first.
Yeah.
But there was something I learned for science communication when I did the kids' book, which is when I did that book, I told the publishers that I'd be happy to do it, but they have to okay it, that the manuscript gets run through a volcano expert.
Oh, I like that for
The volcano
accuracy.
expert needs to be mentioned in the book. And so I found somebody from the USGS named Robert Tilling. It so happens that he's a sort of a big deal as a scientist. I didn't know that at first, but I knew that he liked talking to me and he was a good, clear speaker himself. And so when I don't know if I was all the way done or partly done, I ran the manuscript past him to make sure that I had gotten the science right.
Wow.
Because there's your basis. You try to make it entertaining.
Oh, yeah.
Try to tell the stories and, keep the reader, in this case, kids. 8 to 12 was the age group targeted.
Sure.
But also, you got to make sure you get it right. And so I did that. And I did the same thing with a different person when I came to the adult book. And he happened to be at the Smithsonian's Global Volcanism program.
Wow.
Tom Simkin. And he was a kind of comprehensive guy. He was interested in culture himself and the way science worked, not to mention all the basics.
Sure.
And he really ran me through the ringer in a couple of cases. I even had a beginning that I wanted to try about a volcano in the Cameroons, in Cameroon, the country. And I could not explain the science correctly soon enough for my own deadlines. And I had to give that one up. And I ran that by him a few times, and he would say things like, "John, you are desperately wrong here."
Right.
And he would tell me why. And then finally I thought, all right, forget that part. I'll do things that I can be successful at sooner.
Absolutely. And I'm curious, as far as your book as a whole piece, as a finished, book, how do you think that your work is impacting the way people view volcanoes today? Because, for me reading this book, I have very little background on volcanoes. I'm more of a plant person, and it's really nice to have somebody explain the geology in such a simple and effective way. And so I'm just curious if you've noticed other people have differing opinions after reading your book.
People that have talked to me about it, and I've been invited to various talks, sometimes to geology groups,
Wow.
sometimes just to the general public, seem to appreciate, what should we call it, the enhanced attention, maybe brought to the way human beings and the more than human world, it's a description I like of nature,
Sure.
interweave. And it's impossible for us not to do that. We come out of nature, we live off of nature, we're a part of nature in a certain way. And I think most people that have told me they've liked the book seem to talk about that. And then there's also the matter of stories they never knew had occurred. For example, they didn't realize the effect that a volcanic reaction, let's say, in 1815, would create the year without a summer.
Right.
So you have a volcano in Indonesia, completely on the other side of the world, and it affects the growing season in New England.
Yeah. That's amazing.
Yeah. And that interested me in wider ways because things happen all the time that are out of our sight or out of our time in a way, and they affect our daily lives. And to be a person who's in the position to make that connection between the larger or the more invisible and the daily seems to me a privilege and a way to enhance our reality, to make us understand better that the one and only planet we live on really has consequences.
Absolutely. I would have to agree. So kind of moving from your book to more of just kind of you as a science communicator, I have to agree with you that I think culture needs to come back into science, and science communication is a way to do that. But I'm curious if you see anything specifically that science communication could improve on or could, help with in especially in the current situation with climate change communication or other controversial topics.
Yeah, well, certainly the world has shifted for the worse in the United States in terms of the natural. Well, not natural. It's not natural at all. The way that people respect fact-based evidence. It's become more of a challenge than I ever thought would be the case. Partly because of leadership at the top that is willing to forget all those things. What I have noticed that's makes me optimistic is that lots and lots of young graduate students and postdocs seem to want to communicate a lot more than might have been the case 20 years ago, or certainly was the case 30 years ago. If you're at a university, you have a lot of friends, maybe across the disciplines, and some of them wish that they could have communicated better, but were basically told by advisors or mentors or department heads, put your head down and do your work. And you don't have really time for this communication stuff. It takes extra time. It might water down your work. Loaded words like that. If it gets in the way, then we can't count that as part of your tenure. Achievements. That's changing. I've noticed that mentors don't tend to, in my limited experience, mentors don't tend to tell their students stay away from this stuff. And I think even if they did, a lot of people that I've talked to in the last 5 and 10 years have said, well, I'm doing a blog anyway. I can do it on extra time. It doesn't get in the way of my research. In fact, it helps me understand what I'm doing by thinking about how the public might view it, or thinking about how I might whip it into a story. They're not really saying that it's a key to understanding their own science, but that it helps along the way. And they really understand that they have to find a voice, because in some ways, in general big ways, science is being shunted aside a little bit. Scientists are losing their voice in the public discussion. And I think a lot of the young people really don't want that to happen. And they're ready to fight back and not just explain things because they're important, but also just plain old share their enthusiasm, which is a lot of fun.
Absolutely. I would have to agree with that. And specifically,
You're one of those people.
I was just going to say, I definitely have that curiosity that you were talking about and that drive. And it does make me very upset that people aren't as accepting of scientific methods or scientific facts these days. It's quite sad. I was reading an article earlier about how some people see science as opinion, as opposed to actual fact-based research.
Right, which continually tests itself.
Exactly. And I think that's why I enjoyed your book too, is, you come at it from the side of a scientist in the sense of, the research is always adapting and always changing and always editing itself.
Right.
Which I very much enjoy about that. And I think, that's the side of science that we need to communicate more to other people, specifically the public. But I was going to ask you, as far as your more current work on climate change communication, how specifically have you, and maybe you haven't done this, but how do you, hone in your communication or modify it for more difficult target audiences? Like, I'm thinking more of if you're talking to a more conservative audience who may not be as open to what climate change is, do you notice that you have to change your communication, or is it just kind of for everybody? How do you go about that process?
I think a good example of this first comes not from me, but somebody who's as good a communicator as I can think of, and that is Texas Tech University.
Oh, you must mean Dr. Catherine Hayhoe of Texas Tech University.
Yeah. She is an evangelical Christian.
Okay.
And a atmospheric scientist. And she believes that both of those things can coexist in one person. They do in her. But she's an evangelical Christian who believes in evolution, because that's where the facts point. And she has been a very good bridge in talking to audiences of the general public and talking to religious audiences. And she will change her talk. She will not change the science, of course, when she talks from one audience to the other. So much as, about science communication has to do is who are you talking to now, right, this week,
Right.
or this morning? Is it a junior high class of kids? Is it college seniors? Is it a bunch of postdocs or whatever? And when she talks to an evangelical audience, she might put in some biblical verses that seem to indicate that we're talking about a larger world. And when she talks about Genesis, for example, which she'll bring up, she'll talk about how one way to look at it is not that man shall have dominion over the fishes of the sea and the birds of the air, in the sense that it's all there for us to do what we wish, but that our role is to be stewards and to create sustainability, to maintain sustainability of these things that we have power over now because of, where we are with science and so forth. So she'll highlight some things like that and talk about our role in the world, as opposed to highlighting the science first. But she gets there. So it's a matter of where the emphasis goes.
I see.
So one of the things I do, because I've been a storyteller, my background is as a poet or short story writer, and mostly a nonfiction writer, and I try to tell stories in the traditional way. And so I talk about stories. So I wrote a bunch of blogs for the American Geophysical Union having to do with storytelling. It's called The Plain Spoken Scientist. And the most common story we have in human culture is the journey, right?
Mm-hmm.
Somebody goes away from home on a quest to find something, usually a treasure of some kind. They have personal challenges along the way. They achieve it or they don't achieve it, they find it, and then they bring it back home for the betterment of the community. It's the most common story we have. So I'll tell scientists, if you're going to show a slideshow of what you're doing, why don't you show some pictures of your work in the field along the way to explaining the science so that people know there were real people that went out there in the field, these young people that you see in these pictures. They all jumped in a van, they drove for 8 hours, they went up into the mountains, and look at these measuring devices they used. They were getting real things. That's their journey. They went out to find knowledge and bring it back home.
Right.
So show a picture or two of everybody jumping into the van or working in the field with some kind of instruments. Show that it was difficult, maybe even dangerous, and that there's something of consequence here beyond just the science, but that people really had to work hard to get this stuff. You can do the same thing without the physical dangers of the natural world in talking about a laboratory setting. You can go on a journey down into the microscope, into the subvisible world, and show us what's there. And you can bring back that knowledge and tell us what really matters through your science. But to tell a story is not to dumb down the science, it's to reframe it in a way that an audience can understand so that they can pay attention to the more complicated science that you're going to explain to them, even though you need to do that in everyday language.
Right, absolutely.
I think that makes sense.
Oh yeah, and that's why it's such a challenge is it's so hard to accurately, I think, frame the science, but also try not to dumb it down too much, if that makes sense. Yeah, absolutely.
Right, sure.
Well, I am going to let you go because I don't want to keep you too long for this interview, but thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I've had such a great time.